Can you tell us how some of your um, some interesting ways your collections have been used um, to for research and for people to trigger some material? We have had everything from genealogists to students doing high school projects, uh, writing to us asking for different kinds of material. I'm sure you have even more. Uh, Occasionally, we even get script writers who get in touch with us and ask us about things. Um, what kinds of things have triggered your uh, notice for research going on in your field? Um, Go ahead,
I
Phoenix.
can, I can start with that one just because I've got a few examples that have happened recently. In terms of the research, part of the joy of teaching this material is that science fiction really applies to many disciplines. You've got physicists, you've got literature folks, you've got historians, sociologists, psychologists. So, a couple of examples inside UCR, we had Dr. Stephen Kane in the physics department, who teaches a planets and science fiction class, have students come and use materials from the Eaton collection. So I curated a list of like 35 items for them to navigate because it can be pretty overwhelming, obviously, letting students who are not familiar in special collections say, go and pick an item from the hundreds of thousands. So they looked at those items, learned, the processes of, going to the reading room and handling older or rarer items, and then using those in kind of world building, seeing how the world building takes place to sort of depict alien planets. So that was really exciting. And we've had postdocs who are artists come and use materials, particularly the objects from fandom, in a photography project that I haven't seen the final product yet, but I've had a really great conversation with the scholar, so I'll be curious to see what he comes up with. And then outside of the collection, we actually have had PBS come and use our materials for a couple of documentaries. So one of them is available online. It's called Judy Lynn Del Rey Galaxy Gal, which used a lot of materials from our fandom collections, and we have another one on science fiction in the Los Angeles area, science fiction fandom that's coming out. I think the latest I heard is January 2026, so still a while for that one. But again, I've only been here 2 years in the role, and so part of that 2 years was, reaching out to the various academics, reaching out to folks in the community, both local and on an international level, to say, hey, we're here. I'm the new person, excited to work with you. Let's, there is everything that you want in this collection. So let's work together. So those are a few examples I can think of.
Okay. Susan?
Yeah, so like Phoenix said, we use our fanzines in lots of classes too when we teach archival literacy or how to do original research with primary sources. And one of a really gratifying experience was called the Interdisciplinary Collab. So it's a 4-week um, internship in the summer that pairs students from different disciplines together. So it was a group of 3 students, and they had a faculty advisor, Don Snyder from the Media and Communications Studies department. And they really dove into the fanzines. They created a really nice online exhibit. So they talk about our collections, they talk about fanzines in general, and then they each did kind of a deep dive and an essay on a particular topic like feminism in zines and or like on a particular zine. They also did digital stories, so like videos. And what's really cool about that is that we have this resource now that we can share with everybody. But we also use it in subsequent classes. So we will have students work with, so the 3 digital stories were using Imagination, Futurian, Word Digest, and Triton. And so we will have the students, work with the physical items, and then they'll watch the digital stories that the other students made. So it's kind of like, I feel like it empowers them to know that, yes, they're undergraduate students, but they still have a voice in the scholarly conversation. And the work that they do then could be used in subsequent classes or on websites. Um, so yeah, we use with a lot of classes and a lot of different disciplines, like Phoenix said. And a couple of years ago, a curator from the Drawing Center in New York came down and did some research, and we helped him. He did an exhibit on alternate history. And so not only did he use some of our books, but he used some fanzines like Zero with an X, Xero. I think it's pronounced Zero. G
Yes.
sharp. It's G2. I think it's G sharp. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert. But he also used some of our fan stuff, and that was really cool. And like we saw pictures from it. I didn't to go up and see it, but it looked really great. And again, just helping authors. I can't think of his name right now, but he wrote the Forrest J. Ackerman oeuvre. So we helped him, and someone wrote about Clark Ashton Smith, I think David Schultz, and we helped him. So a lot of outside researchers, but a lot of undergrads too.
Okay. Pete, it's your turn.
Got to stop doing that. So the research into our materials and the use of all of our science fiction materials for classes is ongoing. We are really blessed here to have a special collections that is very, very plugged in to the rest of the university. So we have upwards of 300 class visits a year, sometimes as many as 200 a semester. I will teach anywhere from 8 to a dozen of those class visits. Many of those visits that involve science fiction fanzines and pulp magazines are classes that are focused on those materials. So again, I have a number of faculty members that I've worked with over the years. Some of you may know or have heard of Brooks Landon, a really eminent science fiction scholar. I believe that Brooks is a good friend, Phoenix, of Cheryl Vince. And Brooks has been he just retired, but for years now he's been concentrating on classes that come in to look at pulp magazines, classes that come in to look at science fiction fanzines, and then I actually have a lot more classes that come in to look at media fanzines, but that's every semester, and it gives me an opportunity in every one of those classes to at least begin the class with a short history of the origins of fanzines. And that's when I can pull out all the science fiction fanzines and say, take a look at this. This is how this begins in the 1930s. And these were all young people too, using their free time and their energy to create these publications, just like the kinds of things, that you're doing now. Lots of our students are involved with either OTW as volunteers, or they write fan fiction that gets published in Archives of Our Own, which is part of OTW. And so those classes go on all the time. And I unless they forbid it, I never miss an opportunity to make sure that they understand that all the zine activity that's happening today comes out of science fiction fandom. I've only had one instance where uh, a professor was adamant that zines start in the 1970s,
Really?
that science fiction fanzines and media fanzines are not really zines. And after a certain amount of discussion, I just dropped it, and felt that her students were missing out on learning a little bit of history. But as I say, in 12 years, it's only been one class. So that's a pretty good record. In terms of research, there is just absolutely constant research going on with the science fiction materials. And so much of that, and I saw that Phoenix put into the chat, that Riverside is happy to scan materials for teachers and researchers. If you make that request, and the same is true of us, we're happy to entertain scholarly requests or requests for scans of our materials. And so that goes on all the time. And some of it is fanish, some of it is professional. And then you have the conjunctions of that with someone like David Ritter and First Fandom. And, I've got a real, Rusty Hevlin was a part of First Fandom. I have a real special place in my heart for the origins of fandom and for those first 20 years from 1930 to 1950. And that's where most of my knowledge comes from. So, as a curator, when I began processing Hevlin, and I started with the fanzines. I started with 15 boxes of fanzines. And in 6 months, I still hadn't gotten through those 15 boxes because I was reading fanzines cover to cover, day after day after day after day. And at the end of the 6 months, I went to talk to my boss, who was at that time science fiction fan, Greg Prickman. And he was a friend of Rusty Hevlin's, and he was also a friend of Joe and Gay Haldeman's. Oh, that train of thought just got derailed. That's what happens when you're 71.
Well,
Yeah, I
we
have
can-
no
we can
idea.
bring it up again. No problem with
It'll
that.
come up again. But anyway, films, we have had so many different film crews and film projects approaching us because, as was mentioned before, we have a huge, huge emphasis and always have on television and film. And this is because of so many television and film personalities that have come through University of Iowa. So I am the curator. I used to be the curator of science fiction and popular culture collections, and the science fiction part of that title was dropped a couple of years ago, and that was because of all of the increase in the last few years with attention to both television and film. So that goes on a lot, and we have the papers of Nicholas Meyer, who directed some of the Star Trek films. He directed the atomic bomb film. Oh, Day After Tomorrow, or no, that's not it.
Well,
My
that's
apologies.
wonderful.
My apologies to Nick Meyer. But it's the film that is still the most heavily viewed film in television history. It came on in the 80s. It influenced Ronald Reagan to begin disarming Russia and America's nuclear arsenals. So an incredibly important film, and we have everything relating to that. And the Australians and a number of other film companies are constantly digging through those materials and using those materials. We have the 20th Century Fox collection, which is just everything from silent days into the 70s. And that is an enormous collection and contains the screenplays for really classic science fiction films like Day the Earth Stood Still, so many others. So yeah, it's across the board, every kind of research, lots of different projects, English teachers who are focused in areas like time machines, and they'll come to me and they'll say, what do you have that involves time travel? And you have to just laugh at that point because, how many months do you have? We have tens of thousands of things relating to time travel. And one of the problems with research, I don't know about Susan or about Phoenix, but one of the problems with research is when students and researchers come to us and they say, I want to see all the fanzines you have that have ideas in them relating to, and they name one idea. And that's when I have to say, well, we don't organize our fanzines according to content. Um, that's the beauty of having those 800 fanzines digitized and transcribed, because those transcriptions, which are in DIY history, are word searchable. So you can go to those fanzines into the whole collection and plug in themes or words and then see all the fanzines that bring that up. Or you could put in someone's name, you could put in an author's name to read reviews from the 1930s of works that were appearing in pulp magazines. So that whole area of reception theory within the English department, the people that work with reception theory, that's another thing where they will come in and they will say, what was the fan reaction like to the film Things to Come? Uh, so that kind of project too, going on a lot. Artists, as Susan said, artists coming in. We've done workshops on both hectograph, and we have a video on our video channel on how to make hectograph. We've made videos on famous projects, and this was because of researchers who were interested in different, because we have a center for the book here at Iowa, and we have researchers who are part of the new Mimeo revolution, who are really interested in using Mimeo machines for all kinds of maker projects. They understand that science fiction fandom was influential in this, and then they want to know, well, how was this fanzine made? What printing process was used for this fanzine? So we've done videos on things like Dale and Anita Tarr's Science Fiction World zine, which is, so outstanding because the cover is homemade architect's paper with a homemade blueprint. That's the cover. Then all the pages were done on Mimeo, and all the headers were done on hectograph. And I think and then the whole thing was printed with the paint can method, where the stencil was attached to the paint can, inked up, and then rolled across the sheets of paper that were on the floor. Yeah, that's just an extraordinary
Yep, there were all kinds of
fanzine.
things, including spray guns.
Yeah, well, spray guns, when you really immerse yourself in the fanzines, that's when you gain all of the knowledge that can then be leveraged to all of these different researchers who come to you with these different kinds of requests. And like Phoenix, I think it's just absolutely important that you put together lists so that when students and classes come to you, they're able to navigate the size of our collections and come away with something useful. So I think, yeah, that those kinds of efforts that he's doing are just that's absolutely necessary.
Well, everybody who knows me knows I can't resist throwing in comments here and there. But when you talk to that professor about starting the startup of fanzines, let alone the AJ type things where a lot of science fiction and horror people were involved, if any of you have copies of Lewis Carroll's or under Dr. Dodgson, his fanzines, I'd love to see a copy of it. The Star, I'm drawing a blank on the other title, but he did some of those back in mid 1800s, and I think Kurt Phillips also put someone in, and I can't remember who it was, who also did, it mentioned him in the chat, that also did some things that are pretty much the equivalent of fanzines back in the mid 1800s. And Phoenix, when you got Bruce Pells's collection, what I didn't see in what was left over was whether or not you got the Bologna fanzine.
I can check.
It is printed on bologna and he kept it frozen for years, but I don't know
Oh.
whether or not Elaine kept it and sent it as well.
I have not heard it mentioned in the 2 years I've been here, and I'm sure it would have been, which leads me to think that it probably didn't come to us. I just certainly don't know, unless there's a freezer somewhere in the Saks they haven't told me about with a bologna journal. But I did not know that. That's amazing. I'm
Well,
going to
I
say with no,
believe
we don't have that, but I will have to double check.
it was part, I believe, or maybe this was a different one that Lee Hoffman told me about, of one APA that had one mailing and it
Uh-huh.
could not, the zines in it were all printed on unusual methods. Lee did hers with a wood burning kit.
Oh, wow.
So if anybody knows anything about that, I'm talking to all the audience as well. Please write and tell me because I don't even know the name of the APA, but um, it was done back when Lee Hoffman was active in fandom. So
Yeah, that's
that's
my
it.
project for next week. I'm going to see if I can track any trace of it down.
Okay. Um,
Joe,
yes.
Is Lee still with us?
No, no, she died some
Okay.
years ago. Um,
Okay.
and we're trying to figure out what to do with some of her collection, and things like that.
You don't have the dress that was made out of copies of her zine that fanzine that she wore to the con, do you?
No, I don't believe she kept that one. Um,
Oh, okay.
the Besides some of her fanzines and some of her paperback books, uh,
Do,
we've got things
do,
like her manuscripts and stuff like that.
can I quick tell that story?
Sure, go right ahead.
So Lee Hoffman is writing a really like premier fanzine and fans are loving it. But there are a lot of fans who think that Lee Hoffman is a man. And Lee decides, no, I'm going to go to this con. And so she made a dress out of her fanzine and wore it to the con. And I think that she had a fan badge too. She had some kind of a fan badge that said either I'm Lee Hoffman or I but that story has always stuck with me that
Yes,
to
it is considered legendary,
yeah.
especially some of the reaction she got.
Yeah.
Um, Going to ask a couple of what I hope will be pertinent questions for our uh, viewers here. The Many of our viewers do have substantial collections. I've got two questions for you guys. One is, can you suggest some of the best ways they should keep their collections um, instead of just lying around? And the other one is, do you know any places where if they do want to get rid of their collections, they might have places that would be receptive to getting some of their fanzines? And Susan, I'm going to ask you to start with this one.
Sure. I think two of the most important things are to keep them out of the sun and keep them away from water. Um, a great way to do that is through acid-free folders and acid-free boxes. Putting them in the folders and in the boxes, and keeping them 4 inches off the floor if possible. Um, I know it's hard, but trying not to keep them in basements or attics or garages. Um, that would be my recommendation. If you want to keep them in plastic, don't use vinyl. Make sure it's an inert plastic. Great. You can go to Gaylord or University Products are two places you can buy those kinds of materials to keep your stuff safe. And they even have, specialty boxes there too. But yeah, I mean, so I'm not a curator. Uh, I am a librarian, so we have a curator, but I mean, if anybody is looking to get rid of their collections or part of their collections, they can certainly email us, and I will send it to our curator and you know, if you have an inventory, great. That would be really helpful. Because like I said, we don't have a big staff here, but yeah, we're certainly open and love donations. We get almost yearly donations from Rich Lynch that we're very grateful for. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Okay, Phoenix?
Yeah, that's great advice. And just to build on that, I've dropped a link in the chat to the SIFWE's Legacy Kit, which has a good rundown of how to think about organizing your work, how to nominate someone to deal with the rights, and so on and so forth. But I'll answer the second part first, which is finding a good institution. I think there are probably about 30-ish institutions in the US, at least, who have specialist science fiction fantasy collections. Obviously Iowa, Texas A&M, Riverside, Temple, but I guess you got to think of a few things. One, is what is the nature of your collection? So for instance, I get a lot of emails, and I'm sure we all do in the panel, saying, for instance, I've been collecting science fiction hardbacks my whole life. I've got this wonderful collection. Can I donate it to you? And the answer is usually no, just because we already have the titles is the problem. And it's a amazing collection, I'm sure, and very historical, but given space concerns and just in terms, we can't take everything as much as we want to. Nobody can. And curators and librarians have to think about the not just the physical space, but also the research value, that there's the labor of cataloging and storing and all of this kind of thing. So I think appraising the nature of your collections, if you have personal papers, anything with annotations or correspondence, that immediately becomes much more unique, I guess, in terms of a donated collection, because it's something that's obviously unique to you, and it may not be texts or materials that other institutions already have. So and you have to ask yourself a few questions. So you think, okay, do I have a particular attachment to a certain place, a geographical location, or an institution? Do I want to donate things to my alma mater? Or do I not care about any of that, and I will send it anywhere in the world if it's part of a if it makes intellectual sense to be part of an existing collection? Say, for instance, I know there are this institution has famous science fiction authors and great fandom materials, and I want mine to be a part of that. So sort of really thinking about where you want your materials to end up, how you want them to be used. If you may want to destroy them all. You may want to pull a Kafka and just say, yep, after I'm gone, we're just going to burn them all, and that's it. And obviously, that's your prerogative. We would love you to keep things and preserve things, of course, but it's a unexpectedly emotional decision that has to be made on the donor's part, I think. And then, as well as the practical things of storage. And feel free to reach out to, curators, librarians, department heads, send them an email and say, hey, I'm thinking of, I have this collection. Are you collecting? I can drop links in the chats, but for instance, a lot of library websites have collection development guidelines pages, so you can see the collecting areas that folks are interested in. So definitely check those out first. As Susan mentioned, if you do have at least a rough inventory, it doesn't have to be an item by item list, because obviously those could run into the thousands. But say, even if it's like 3 boxes of letters between me and so-and-so, and then 5 boxes of, fanzine drafts or whatever, that gives us a great idea in terms of being able to assess, do we have the space? What is the capacity? That kind of thing. So yeah, check the Legacy Kit, make some decisions about where you want your collections to go, and then reach out to folks who can give you more information. And I'm sure we can all put our emails in the chat after this, and feel free to reach out to any of us. And it's not, don't worry about, it's not awkward in terms of we're not in competition with each other. I feel it's we just want, at the end of the day, to help people look after their collections and make sure that they go to the right place, whether it's Iowa, whether it's Riverside, whether it's whoever, so always ask questions, reach out to us, and we're happy to help.
Okay, Pete, anything to add?
Well, I would echo what Susan said. Keep it dry, keep it in the dark. That is, I think, absolutely that's the bottom line. If you can go beyond that in terms of storage, that's great. I saw that someone put in the chat that a friend of theirs had a comic collection. All of it was in plastic bags. There was a flood. The plastic bags preserved the comics. What I can say about that is that under the wrong conditions, plastic bags, especially if they're vinyl, will create microclimates, and those can be damaging to the materials that are inside. When I'm taking in donations of comics, I tell who's ever working on that to throw all those plastic bags away. And, you know, I've worked with our conservation department really closely on things like preservation and conservation of materials. So I think that dark and dry, and if you're going to put something in plastic, think about maybe something like Mylar. If your collection means a lot to you, think about spending a little bit of money to preserve it. If you can't, stick to dark and dry. Phoenix, I think, has given some really good specifics about the kinds of options that you have, the kinds of things you can do. My philosophy has always been email anybody that you need information from. Doesn't matter who they are, where, you know, how famous, how busy, none of that means anything. You should reach out to whoever you think, you know, might be able to help you. And I think if they're librarians, chances are really good that they will. If they can't help you, they'll try to find someone who will. I would agree with Phoenix that for the most part, we're not in competition with each other. But there are elements of competition involved in any kind of collecting. And we are all, to an extent, operating as collectors ourselves, putting together collections ourselves. So for the most part, I'm going to do exactly what he said. If something is offered to me and I know that another institution focuses in that area, or if someone's offering me author's papers, and I just routinely will look to see if those papers are at any other institutions. There is a reality, and this is true of fanzines as well. This is true of science fiction fandom materials as well. What you will often find out is that a donor found an institution to take the bulk of what they wanted, which can often be the best of what is there in that collection, but they have this part of the collection that remains, and they can't find a home for that. And eventually they're offering it to you. And at that point, at least I'm speaking for myself now, at that point, I would say to them, the bulk of your collection is at such and such an institution. I would think that you should try again to have them take in this part that you're offering to me. If the case is that they turned it down, I may have to turn it down as well. In terms of fanzines and science fiction materials, something for collectors to understand, I think, and I'm not sure that this is something that comes to mind for them. They are all collecting the same thing. So science fiction fanzine collectors, depending on what decades they're focusing on, everybody else who's collecting fanzines from that period has the same fanzines. So it took me a long time. It took me a lot of years, you know, to kind of take that in and absorb it to the point where I realized I can't take in collections without a list anymore, because we don't have room for thousands and thousands of duplicates. Now, when I started, my boss was Greg Pickman, who was also my mentor. And when it came to duplicates of fanzines, Greg's philosophy was, well, we can go through there and we can read duplicates, but that's going to take a lot of work. And then we're going to wind up with this collection of duplicates. And what are we going to do with that? And so there's the time and the effort and everything else that's gone into that weeding. The fanzines are so thin. And so if you have 2 copies of a fanzine, why not just keep them both? We're also talking about things that were generated off of stencils. And so depending on whether that fanzine was at the beginning of the run of the stencil or towards the end of the run of the stencil, one copy might be just incredibly legible and pristine. Another copy might be really faint. And maybe the art in that one is really faded now. So, you know, for the longest time, we took in dupes and never thought about it. But now I just absolutely can't, because our available space dwindles every day. And you know what I've always hoped I'd have the opportunity to do, and this is so great that we're doing it now, to speak to the community and to be able to say, you all need to understand and remind yourselves that we work for institutions that, and if we're talking about a special collections and university archive, we're collecting across every possible field and discipline. And science fiction and genre literature is just one part of that. But here at Iowa, and this is, you know, mainly my fault, or if it's not my fault, I'm responsible. An absolutely enormous amount of available space within the department and within storage is now all completely devoted to pop culture materials, and the bulk of that is devoted to science fiction. So I've got a lot of pressure on me from my superiors, who will say things to me like, are we done? Pete, do we have enough now? Are we done? And there's the question, you know, of representative collections. Lots of people feel like if they have 100 linear feet of anything, well, that's plenty. You don't need to have 5,000 linear feet of something to be able to satisfy researchers. And then the other thing I would say is try to understand the difference for us between what's cool and what's valuable to research. And I was glad that Phoenix raised that about value to research. In our positions, we are mandated to be constantly thinking about, does this material have the potential to be valuable to research? That's our mandate. That's our goal. So often things that are really cool in any way will not have a whole lot of value to research. And you know, what's an example? If you have a lot of photographs from a con from 40 or 50 years ago, and all of those photographs are completely undescribed, not the year, not the con, not the people in the photograph, just understand that that's going to have very little value to research in the future. And that even if you try to get people like crowdsource that material and to try to supply that metadata, the people that could give you that information, unfortunately, are all beginning to pass away. And so rapidly, we're going to be left, all of our institutions, I would think, we're going to be left with an enormous amount of material that's no longer valuable to research, because no one's ever going to be able to identify where it's from, who's in it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, you know, that's another thing that keeps me anyway, and keeps us here at Iowa from taking in certain things. So to collectors, I would say, if you're thinking about sending stuff to Iowa, or you definitely get in touch with me. Don't ignore everything I've just said, and whatever you have, get in touch with me and we'll talk about it. But we're talking about photographs. Yeah, I'd really like them to be identified. I'd like to know what year they're from. I'd like to know what con they were shot at. If it's fanzines, I'm going to need to see a box list. I'm going to need to see a list of what you have that I can then compare against holdings. If it's pulp magazines, sure, I'm happy to look at a list and compare that against holdings. But if you tell me that you have 10 boxes of really great pulp magazines from the 30s, that's when I would have to say I probably have them all already in duplicate or triplicate, and I need to see a list to see if I can use that to fill in gaps or. So yeah, definitely get in touch. I would say with any of the three of us. I saw in the chat that somebody mentioned the SFCLC. That's the consortium that Phoenix and I both belong to. Susan, you could if you wanted to. And this is the consortium of people who work with science fiction collections, institutions that have science fiction collections, et cetera, et cetera. And very often someone is offered a collection. And if they can't take it, they send that offer out to the rest of the group. And, hopefully someone may be able to take it in. I think that in terms of competition, I think we've all said over the years that our only real competition is the dumpster. I don't like to ever hear that someone died and everything they had wound up in the dumpster. Denny Lean, fantastic Minnesota fan who passed away not long ago. I got to talk with him and work with him before he died on trying to take as much of his collection as I could take in. Unfortunately, I could only take in, I took in a lot, but I couldn't even touch how much he had. And then I believe there was some kind of an accident and there was a lot of stuff in the basement that, wound up being lost. And there was a huge effort to get things. And this was all assisted by fans and volunteers to get as much as possible out of the house because his house was being turned over to Habitats for Humanity. And so everything that was stored in it had to get out. And Denny passed away while I was still talking to him and negotiating with him. And I had to follow up on all of that with Mike Ward. And Mike was fantastic, another really great fan. So, yeah.
Well, that's
Collections.
the kind of thing. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that happens again and again, and unfortunately, more frequently now than it has been happening even in the past. Although the collectors and some of the collectors now have been collecting collections from previous generations of fans. So there is lots of material, things like that out there. What I'd like to ask you is there anything coming up for your university collection, particularly in the fanish aspects, in the next year or so that would be worth telling some of the people here that they might either want to monitor or participate in? Would you have anything like that? You mentioned several of you have mentioned that there are some both classes and things. And one question that was asked early on was whether or not there are listings of courses at the various universities. But what I wanted to ask again was, is there anything that collectors would be interested so that they can both learn more and better protect things on a private basis? Have a lot of answers on that one. Well, let me ask another question. Why don't you explain a little more the SLC? Is that something that collectors should be paying attention to?
Do you mean the SFCLC?
Yes.
Oh yeah, so yeah, it's basically just a mailing list with, like I mentioned, there's about 30. Don't know the exact number of members, but I think it's about 35 librarians, curators, who not just in the US but around the world, who have notable science fiction collections. And like Pete was saying, we will from time to time email each other, and say, hey, email the listserv and say, we have this collection offer come in. We happen to have all the titles, but is anybody else interested? So we share those kinds of opportunities. And regarding your last question, yeah, like I mentioned, the the online Eaton Symposium will be made available on our YouTube channel, so you can see the panels in the coming few weeks. We have the in-person student-run conference in April, and then also I myself, I'm just going to try and get to a few cons this year. So there's ICFA in Orlando if anyone's going to be there. There's WorldCon in Seattle. In the library world, I'm going to RBMS, which is my old stomping ground at Yale, and then maybe ReaderCon, we'll see. But again, travel budgets are finite, so and whatever conference, conventions or FANAC gatherings you go to, if there is a librarian there, like, go and say hi to them and go and ask them these kinds of questions and what they're looking for.
Okay. Is there any last thing that you would like to pass on? And then we'll open it up for questions, because a lot of questions have been popping up in the chat. So Edie has a bunch of them to ask. Susan, any last couple of remarks?
I mean, just thank you for having me. I'm still learning, and I love learning from all of you. And like both of my colleagues have said, feel free to reach out. Again, like Peter said, we're librarians. We'd like to help. We will find whatever you're looking for, or help you find, or point you in the direction, even if it's not coming to our institution. So,
Okay. Pete?
I don't know. I've talked so much, and I apologize. I used to talk about geezers, and that geezers were always in full anecdote mode. And I can honestly say that I've tried to be restrained and completely failed. But I think that, what I would say is this. Yeah, there are events and there are all kinds of like things that, fans and other people could like do and see. I'm going to be doing a lot of I'm going to be concentrating more and more in, however many years I have left, on really trying to serve the faculty and the students at this institution. So I'm going to be doing a lot more pop-up exhibits. I'm going to be doing some really big exhibits in the next couple of years, and I could always, let you know about that, and we'll probably try to let SFCLC know about that. But I think, what I would say is this: go to FANAC, go to Eaton, go to Baltimore, and come to Iowa Digital Library and DIY Transcript, and learn about the history of science fiction fandom the way that I did. Oh, I remembered. So this is the Trump weave. I'm coming way back around again. I remembered what I was going to say before. My boss, Greg Prickman, when I went in to say to him, I'm so sorry that I haven't done very much work in 6 months. Please don't fire me. Greg said to me, no, I knew when I gave you this project that you were going to sit and read fanzine after fanzine after fanzine, and that when you didn't know something, you were going to look it up. And when you saw a name, you were going to dig into that. And that's why you have this job, which they created for me. And what I know is that everything that I've ever learned about the history of fandom and the history of the origins of science fiction, because there's no genre that has the close relationship between its fandom and its creators, like science fiction. And that's historical. And, again, so many fans have been librarians. So many authors, like Phoenix, have been librarians or archivists. So, that connection is so solid. So, dig in, pick a city, pick any of the great science fiction cities. We have the collection of Dal Koger, and some of the old timers might remember Dal as being really influential with like Mid-South Con and other Southern cons. But when he was a young man before World War II, he lived at the Slant Shack with the Ashleys in Battle Creek. And then he got into the service and was stationed near Los Angeles. So then he started going to Las Vegas. So, you don't find that kind of stuff out unless you read the fanzines. The covers are great. The artwork is great, but you got to read those zines to learn that history, because that history, the big news, I think the big news is that what we have collected at our institutions and at all the other institutions that are collecting in this area, what we've done is to enable anyone to learn the complete history of the genre, starting with the books, moving into pulp magazines, fandom growing out of pulp magazines, fans growing into professional authors, but remaining fans. So they keep going to cons, they keep sending free work to fanzines to be published. Same thing with fan artists who became pro artists, and then all of the decades that follow. So dig in and enjoy that history. And, some of us have talked about things like butts and seats. Everybody loves to see researchers in the reading room. And at the risk of alienating people, the last thing I'm going to say is, yes, look at stuff online. Look at everything that we have online. Check out those resources. But you got to start coming. You've got to start coming to our institutions to physically look at some of this stuff, because that's what convinces our superiors that it's all completely viable. The more classes, the more people through the door, the more people requesting these materials, that is all justification for us to keep going. And don't just rely on the digital, though I know we're heavily involved in that, and Joe's heavily involved in that. And what I would say, okay, I said that would be the last thing. The last thing that I'm going to say is, I think that everybody that's working in this area has to give an enormous vote of thanks and to Joe and Edie, and to Mark Olson, to the fans and everyone from First Fandom, to the fans who have taken this on for decades to archive this history, to make paying attention to the history of their own community foremost in their minds, and to do the heavy lifting. As soon as FANAC surpassed 1,000 digitized copies, and I knew that our whole project had stalled, because we haven't digitized any science fiction fanzines since the original librarian that we hired left, and we ran out of funding, and I haven't been able to procure more funding for the project. But whenever I try now, because I've made so many people here aware of FANAC, what they say to me is, Pete, I don't think we have to digitize any fanzines anymore, because it seems as though that community is doing such a great job of doing that themselves. So still, thank you so much, Joe, Edie, Mark Olson, David Ritter, everyone that from the community that has led this work, shown us the areas that we can aid you in, and that you've shown interest in what we do and made this effort to try to understand what we can do, what we can't do, what our challenges are, etc. So thanks very much.
Okay, well, Phoenix, you have anything last?
Mic drop for Pete. That was beautiful. I agree with everything, 100% echoing the thanks.